We'll start the meeting today as we always do, in silence. Let's just close our eyes and go back inside and just simply be with yourself and whatever is. Good morning, Jack.
Good morning. So we'll see where this one goes. I feel like I've got a lot of threads and lots of shorter questions. The one that's really come up for me over the last week is that tandem feeling, or that ping-pong swinging feeling between when we feel that beautiful grace, that expansion, that trust, when you're really in the knowing that consciousness is animating everything, and then you get caught in grief. And there's two parts to this question, but the first part is being consciousness expressing itself through a human body and all those human emotions and experiences. Can you share some of, and even some personal experience around working with grief in a way that means that we don't lose contact with that consciousness and that truth? Because it can be, I find we can get really lost in it, and then we feel grief about the loss of that contact as well.
Grief is one of the strongest emotions that a human being can feel. And I think there is a critical moment in experiencing grief, and it's normally not at the beginning of the grief, not at its highest impact, but when the separation, the idea of a separate person, starts to take possession of it, and then weave stories around it. And at that moment, grief, which is in the moment, which is in the present, gets turned into something that has a future and a past. So it gets extended in time and thereby becomes suffering. All suffering happens to a person, a separate person. And I remember a friend telling me when he was experiencing the strongest feelings of grief that he had over a very personal loss that he'd gone through, that it was actually at the moment of its highest impact, its strength, that he found a tremendous peace in that moment too. And it's the peace that is available through any experience that we have in the present moment. It's that peace that allows us to be completely here now. And even if we are engulfed in feelings of grief and pain, the very fact that we're with it, the very fact that we stay with it, and we're not extrapolating some narrative from it, some story around it, but just simply feeling that intense pain within our body-mind, that in itself can be a transformative experience. So the loss of that presence, the loss of being in the present with anything, takes place when narrative starts to recreate identity that's based in the past and the future. If experiences are felt and lived through when they're happening, they actually leave no residue. They can be complete in and of themselves in that moment. Now, with a process like grief, very often those moments will keep coming, that you'll be overwhelmed, often takes you by surprise. You're suddenly hit again with this immense feeling of pain at the loss that you've been through. But again, if that pain is experienced then and there, in that moment, in that present moment, then that pain will not turn into suffering, which is a much more difficult thing to deal with because it's engaged the mind in a story. So I think the way through grief or any intense experiencing is to be with it, just to be there with whatever is, which is the fundamental basis of all that I call meditation. And of course, in terms of intense feeling, in those times that we're being racked to our very core by grief and the loss of normally someone very close to us, it's difficult to stay with that feeling. It hurts so much that it's natural that one wants to avoid it, but the more one can just be with it, the quicker it will pass, the quicker it will be integrated, the quicker that the lessons and the insights that it is actually bringing to the person involved will be seen and learnt. So consciousness is always just doing what consciousness does. And the content of consciousness is constantly changing. And the way we stay in touch with that truth of all the things that we encounter here are being animated by this very same energy, that energy of consciousness. The more we can stay in the present and be with whatever is, the closer we can keep that understanding to us. In fact, there is no difference between that understanding and being in the present. That being in the present is being with consciousness. There's no gap there whatsoever. Your mind may not be able to recognize it until later, when you consider the experiencing that you've just been through and wrap a concept around it. But actually what is going on in any intense present experiencing, you are just consciousness. So there's no easy way to move through intense periods of feeling within a human body. But it's what we came here for. Mm-hmm. It's why we're here. It's what the purpose, the meaning of this place, this manifestation is, to bring us intensity that we can experience and learn from. And in that learning, grow, come closer towards our ultimate destiny, which is to understand that we were never actually here as a separate person, and that we've always been just one.
And what about one of my students last week described an experience of losing their child recently, young child, and quite powerfully and potently could describe exactly what you just said about that, the being present with and feeling the grief, and then getting caught in that as a way to come back to that love that she experienced for her child. And she said, I feel like I've gone like completely off-road with it now. Like that she called it a pure experience, the pure experience of grief, just so present to it, and how actually so beautiful and intoxicating it was. But the pain of then coming out of that and experiencing another level of grief. The advice from everyone to her is like, you've got to stay with it, you've got to stay with it. And she's also got to function and has other children. And I just wanted to, I guess the question was that she posed to me was navigating, she sort of called them like the levels of grief. There's that really pure grief, and then there's that convoluted, complicated grief, and the narrative would sit in that. And being able to ensure that you can return, or not that you can ensure, sorry. I'm just trying to think of your exact words. Her fear around not being able to get back to that pureness of the grief and getting lost in the narrative and the doing, navigating that. I don't know if that's making so much sense, but...
Again, I'm going to always come back to this nagging question, who's doing the navigating? Mm. And in the very description of the states that your friend has been through, you can see exactly when the person returns, and it's that person that starts to consider things that really aren't absolutely needed to be planned out or dealt with within the framework of time. The more that a person can stay with the experience in the present moment, the more quickly that experience will be felt and understood. And yes, of course, it's natural that the old habit of separation will return. And it's also natural that there will be an experience of loss back to the purity of that present moment of grief. And the purity is not about the grief. The grief itself, the intensity of those particular feelings may increase the sense of purity. But the purity is being now. That purity is not about grief. It is about simply being here now. That purity is available to any human being in any realm of human experiencing by simply remaining here now. So it's natural that until the understanding is there that this separate idea of a person is not actually true, has landed in its totality. It's very natural, and it's part of the journey of seeking, that there will be an in and out phasing in that sometimes you'll be here now and not concerned with any narrative or a separate identity, and at other times things will pull you back, sometimes because of their intensity, and sometimes just out of old habit. So there's no magic potion to insulate you or to take you faster through a destined experience. The one ingredient that anyone can bring to any experiencing is an openness. And of course, I emphasize, everyone should remember that openness doesn't mean a passive state. Openness means also being open to feeling closed. It's the openness prior to the feeling that I'm talking about. And that openness prior is the space of the witness. It's that openness that remains there. The ability, the willingness to be with whatever is, including the times where you close down, including the times where you can't manage, including everything that takes place. There is always something seeing it. There is always that which sees. And the more that this understanding lands in a human body mind, the stronger that sensation will grow inside of that individual. So these moments, these periods of intense feeling, of intense experiencing are, and I mean this sincerely, are gifts from God, even though they hurt like you want to die. In the case of losing a child, it is still a gift from God. It is something that has drawn you into a presence and a wealth of feeling and experiencing that is rare. And yes, it's come at a terrible cost on a personal level. But as much as it's possible to do, I would always try and tune into the gift that this particular loss brings you, without that becoming a simply sentimental avoidance of feeling. Feel everything to the very depths of your being. But in the feeling of it, see that this is a gift, that even though you've lost someone that you dearly, dearly, dearly loved, he or she is still in communication with you through the events that are being triggered by this loss. And I'm not wrapping any esoteric meaning around that. I'm just looking at the facts of it. You lose a child, and that loss of that child reverberates in you your whole life. And that is the gift of that particular experience. It in no way contradicts the immense sadness and pain you feel at the loss of that human being that you were umbilically connected with. But it helps you to understand, to tune into a bigger picture. And that bigger picture is the picture of the witness. And that is your reality here in consciousness. That is your reality. I just read one quote from my wall that is relevant here. It's from Nisargadatta Maharaj. And he says, in reality, there is only one state. When distorted by self-identification, it's called a person. Now that's when that separate identity, that narrative of why me, of why is this happening to me comes up, then that particular state is called the state of a person. When coloured with the sense of being, it is the witness. Here in this manifestation, we are involved in a place of being. And in that space of being, the core of that is the ability to see, the ability to observe, to witness. And that is the closest any human being can come in this manifestation to the actual origins of its appearance. And then the last sentence he ends with, when colourless and limitless, it is called the Supreme. The Supreme is one way of expressing where we all come from, the source, our fundamental reality.
So something that I've experienced deeply for myself, and I see pop up a lot with our students, is this concept and this truth starts to deeply land. They're able to witness, to watch, to stay in the present moment. And then there's multiple hurdles of like a panic or a kickback from the ego, which is that if there's no individual doing, consciousness is flowing through, when does planning take place? And often it's like the baby gets thrown out with the bathwater. So we're just so present that then no planning takes place whatsoever. But obviously that's not true. Can you, your experience with that sort of oscillation and that move between still needing to plan and then not being attached to the planning, but it still needs to take place. Can you share how you work with that?
Yeah, sure. I think the first thing to start with is what I nearly always do around planning, is to understand what's actually going on with planning. So how does a human being make a plan? A human being makes a plan based on the only information that they have, which is always to do with the past. So essentially a plan is made by an individual based on their past experience. And the focus of a plan will be to try and maximize pleasure, maximize the positive experience for that separate individual, and to minimize the negative experience. And that will simply be something that is distilled from everything they've learnt from before. So if you see that planning rests on past experience, you see right away the dangers of it, that essentially you're involving yourself in repetition, that inevitably you'll only be working with things you already know, and then your availability, your openness to what you don't know yet is being limited by that. So it's like facing something new, carrying the weight, the burden of your past experience. So that's, for me, the fundamental questioning that anyone can do around planning. Do I want to live my life like that? I see that all planning is going to be based on past experience, and I see how that restricts the possibility of life bringing me the new, the wondrous, the mysterious. Then actually, is that serving me? Once you've understood that, then you start to have a subtler relationship around planning. Now, we live in a society that is massively over-planned in every department. And there is absolutely no reason, no practical reason whatsoever that an individual has to buy into that. The buying into it will again be based on the past, will be based on wanting something good to happen and wanting to avoid something bad. But there is no reason to follow that repetitive neurosis. You can actually allow yourself to have more space in the way you face the present moment and what may come after it by simply deciding not to plan in a particular set of circumstance that when you make that decision doesn't freak you out. So I'm not suggesting that you suddenly start leaving things that clearly do need a little advanced planning until the last moment, and then having your superego go, when it all goes wrong, having your superego go, you see what happens when you don't plan? Everything goes wrong. That's self-defeating. It's not going to help you at all. But there are ways that you can enter into a simple, playful experimentation with how you run your life. Just that simple playfulness can lose a lot of the unnecessary planning that goes on in everyone's life. So that's the first step, I would suggest, is that once you begin to see that you're not the doer, then before that understanding has landed completely in you, and in its landing then starts to direct your life from that understanding, from that wisdom. Before that has completely taken place, again, there'll be a period of transition. You can start to playfully engage with habit around planning and see what's not needed. And more importantly than that, when you do go into this playfulness, then watch the results. Because it's in seeing the results, it's in seeing the benefits of what comes towards you that will give you the trust and the let go and the impetus to continue to stretch those boundaries within the way you live your life. Now, how is planning experienced in a body-mind that understands that he or she is not the doer? It's experienced in the same way that everything else is experienced. That yes, on the outside, some planning may be perceived by someone else to have taken place in a particular body-mind that has understood the falsity of personal doership. But from the perspective of that body-mind, it will not be felt that way. The planning will simply become part of a natural flow that doesn't require any excess energy, that certainly doesn't go into any neurotic fear about control, about making sure that things go as I want them to go and they don't go wrong. That has completely disappeared. But the actual mechanics of planning also start to feel completely natural, that they're not demanding excess energy from you, that they simply happen in and of themselves without any fuss. Now, again, from the outside, it'll be difficult for a person still identified with being a separate doer not to project that identification when he or she observes the actions through a different body-mind where that identification as a personal doer has disappeared, because that projection will be natural for the person to assume that the doership is still taking place in the same way, but it's not. The experience within that separate body-mind who has understood that he or she is not the doer is one of the flow. And planning still takes place. Some events do need advanced planning, but it's not experienced in the same way. It's experienced as something seamless, something that simply happens now, in the context of now. And yes, in the context of now, events are being molded for something that will happen on a timescale in the future. But none of that is going on within the body-mind of the person who's understood that he or she is not the doer. It is simply experienced as the flow.
I've witnessed that with you when we've been planning the retreats, and it's delight, but it's also fascination around that I've witnessed and seen in you when it's the dissolving of the idea of good or bad. It's like, oh, that's happening and that's happening. It's not like, that's great, that's terrible. And I think that being able to really see that firsthand, not being faked, but genuinely just curious to, well, let's see what's happening next. And a not, because I get sticky with detail and narrative myself, being able to watch that take place has been so helpful of, dropping those ideas of good and bad that, oh, good, I'm going to wait, this is a good thing happening in the planning, and I'm going to wait, this is a terrible thing happening against the plan. So it all becomes for and against the plan. Did that take a long time for you to cultivate?
Those questions are very difficult to answer, because one of the things that takes place, certainly in this body-mind, is it's very difficult to actually nail the exact moments where this understanding took root. I don't experience it that way. I look back and try and place a particular event or series of events on how this took place, and it's very hard to actually nail it down. There are certain events that stand out, but they're normally events of intense insight that one doesn't so easily forget because they were beautiful. But they, in and of themselves, aren't necessarily the whole story. There may be a period of time that takes place after that where these things land. So I can't really put a time scale on it because, truthfully, it doesn't happen within time. Time is simply a functional tool that we have to make things perceptible in the place we find ourselves. Time and space are simply concepts by which we can actually perceive. But when you enter into these realms, these areas of experience, you are now. You are in the present moment. And so to fit them into a narrative that involves past and present and future becomes more and more difficult. But I think one thing I would like to say from this last question is indeed about good and bad. And I think what's important to point out is this fixation that our conditioning has on maximizing pleasure, the good, and avoiding, minimizing pain, the bad. But actually, where we are is a place of contrast, of variety. We are in a manifestation that is made up of interconnected opposites. And as I've said before, without those opposites, we would simply not be able to perceive. It's the existence of white that allows us to see black and vice versa. So those opposites are in fact one. They allow us perception. And when you see the necessity of whatever the opposite is, it can help you start to relax around these more moral judgments that are based on fear. That actually life is made up of good and bad. That's how it is. And actually, if you look at the experience of bad and you break it down, you inquire into it, very quickly you'll come to see that most of the experience that you call bad is resistance to that experience. The experience itself happens in the moment, but it's the story that reacts to that experiencing that then extends it from the past into the future and brings suffering to that separate person. So if you really look at how you experience good and bad, you come back to what we were saying at the beginning of this talk around grief. Bad experienced in the moment is another experience. It's another experience that's available in this plane of interconnected opposites where we find ourselves. And it's an experience from which we can learn. In fact, pain is a call for our attention. It's the bad, the so-called bad, that is the engine room, the driving force behind us going deeper inside ourselves, behind the desire to understand and to get to the core of our own individual reality. So what happens as the understanding lands inside of you is that, as you said in your question, instead of a reaction to something bad being, oh, I hate this, I wish it hadn't happened, then a different kind of response starts to appear, which is, oh, I didn't expect that. Something I would have previously considered bad just took place. I wonder what will happen next. And it's that openness, that lack of resistance, that acceptance of whatever is that allows you to learn to understand and to be available to the next moment and not miss that.
I think it was Ramesh said acceptance weakens the ego, and you a couple of years ago highlighted this for me. You were like careful not to keep fueling and feeding your ego structures with resistance too. Would you say that folds in on this as well? It's the...
Yeah, for me, the word acceptance I always find is the most religious word in the English language. It's a magic alchemical ingredient, and you can't force it. There's no point in trying to become falsely accepting, like becoming falsely humble. But you can see it, and you do know it when you're in that space yourself. You know in that space everything is right with the world. There's never anything wrong in acceptance, including, as we've pointed out before, the acceptance of such a painful experience as grief around the loss of a loved one. In the acceptance of that grief is the transcendence of it. It's the resistance to that grief that then starts to create the story and the separation. So for me, acceptance is a magical word in that way. And it is the quality of acceptance that people will start to notice in their lives as this understanding of not being a separate doer, not being a separate person, starts to settle and land within their lived reality. They'll start to see that they suddenly don't any longer need to fight so much. They don't need to resist so much. They're not so scared of things going wrong. They're not so afraid of being wrong themselves. They start to experience a spaciousness inside themselves that allows them much more freedom of movement and response and a much deeper level of feeling within those responses, and most importantly, that allowing within themselves starts to spread into all the people that they're connected with. And they start to allow the same freedom, the same ability to make a so-called mistake in others, in the people they love, they care for, or in people they simply meet day to day. So then you're involved in one of these wonderful virtuous circles that as you experience more and more acceptance inside yourself, you share that and allow that acceptance into other people's lives and the way they behave. And they feel that, and then that relaxes them too, and so on and so forth. That's how you change the world.
Beautiful. So something that I find is often feels like it's in contrast to what we're discussing. And I'm going to read a quote from your wall from the Buddha. "We are what we think. All that we are arises with our thoughts. With our thoughts, we make the world." And I find that sometimes there's a friction point. I don't know if it's due to the way some teachings are delivered or modern psychology around this idea that we, there's sort of one school of thought that says, be careful what you think, because everything you think you become, and that's your nervous system, and that's your world and your reality. And then there's also another entirely like a body of thought around just drop your thoughts, don't engage with your thoughts. And then the Buddha here saying that everything that we think makes the world. What are your thoughts on thinking, and particularly overthinking, because I'm great at it?
Yeah, there's quite a few elements to that question. Let's deal with the basic process of thinking. I think it's important everyone acknowledges and understands that they have no control over their thoughts, that it's been scientifically proved, and actually it's the basis that neurologists are convinced of the non-existence of individual free will, is the gap between thoughts landing and our response to them. Thoughts happen in each of us. It's almost like the mind, when it's free of neurosis, when it's free of attachment, is like a spinning radar dish. It's completely impersonal. It just picks up everything that's out there to be picked up. There's a wonderful Zen saying, which is, what's the nature of the mind? The nature of the mind is to wander. Let it wander. So the mind is this amazing crystalline function that picks up whatever is out there in the universe and lands it in us according to our destiny. And then it's our response to those thoughts that then dictate how our world is made. So when Buddha says we are what we think, Buddha's not saying you are responsible for those thoughts landing in you. Where you get caught in the thinking process is actually when emotion is triggered inside of you by thought. If you really look and see what makes thought cling to you, it's because they've triggered inside of you some unresolved emotion that you haven't understood, or you haven't integrated, or you haven't let go of. And it's that emotion that then compels the brain to continue thinking around that thing again and again and again and again. I'll tell you one personal experience from the very first long silence I did up in the Himalayas. It was the very first long one I did 4 months. And it was fascinating in one way, because what I noticed inside the process of sitting silently over that long period of time was that thoughts would come up and they would follow a very precise chronological order. The most recent events would be the ones that would come up to begin with. And what I started to notice over the days and the weeks and the months of simply sitting and watching my thoughts happen inside me was there was a certain period of time that the brain, the system, had to chew on a particular thought. And then suddenly, without any warning, and sometimes without me even noticing it, that thought was gone, and the next one would be there. And the two things I noticed was, one, I could never voluntarily decide how much chewing the brain needed to do on a particular thought. It would chew for as long as it needed to. And the way I experienced that was that length of actual time was directly related to how sticky that particular thinking around normally past events was inside of me. So the more difficult, the more convoluted, the more hidden, the less understood the particular area of thinking was about, the longer it appeared to last. And then I noticed that the brain would simply go back through my life chronologically over the weeks and months. And each time it came to somewhere where something was triggered, some emotion hadn't been understood, hadn't been integrated, then it would need to spend time just chewing over that. And that chewing, that friction, somehow in a mysterious way that I don't fully understand, released it, and it went on to the next one. So that's how I see the process of thinking as we understand it, the painful aspect of thinking. It is actually the thought that triggers the unresolved emotion inside of you that then brings up your response from that past. So in that dimension, the words of Buddha are relevant. We are what we think. The way we think is being dictated by what we haven't understood in ourselves. Thinking, when it's relieved of that burden, simply follows a natural process that is, yes, dictated by our DNA and by our conditioning, or up to the moment conditioning. But if that conditioning has been clearly seen and understood, then the way that those thoughts will be filtered and expressed and acted upon, if necessary, will be a simple, natural process, which will be individual. You will do that in your way. I will do it in my way. It'll be unique to both of us. But it won't be involved in resisting it. It won't be involved in repeating unnecessary reactions that have their root, have their foundation in something we haven't understood. So in that sense, we are what we think. When you've understood inside yourself, you are simply a vehicle of consciousness or God. And when you, in that understanding, start to observe the actual living of that truth and what that feels like, how you experience that, the beauty of the freedom and the depth of feeling and experience that is released from you not getting in the way any longer. When you've reached that particular space, then thinking becomes a beautiful process. It doesn't in any way disturb. It's the highest aspect of the mind. It's full of creativity and insight and wonder. As long as the mind is there serving a useful purpose by throwing a bunch of thoughts at you from the universe and seeing which ones trigger you and get stuck inside of you, then again, that's a call for your attention. That is a call for you to inquire, to understand, what is it that I can't get past in this thought? What is it that hurts me when I think like that? All that we are arises with our thoughts. If you are resisting a particular thought, if you are going crazy by a thought grabbing you and forcing you to go over it and over it and over it and feel whatever it is that hasn't been understood, that is at its base, then that will be what you are. All that we are arises with our thoughts, because our thoughts trigger those responses as a way to help us see what needs to be understood, what needs to be let go of, what needs to be accepted. And then he ends, with our thoughts we make the world. When you wake up in the morning, there is sometimes a brief period of wonder where you know you are conscious, you know you are alive, but the story of you has not yet landed. You are in this like wonderful limbo land of the present without separation, the present without narrative, without identity. You are simply here now in a state of being. And then suddenly, crash, the whole narrative of your separation lands again. And just milliseconds after the landing of I, of that separate I takes place, the whole world that I relates to, that I has created over these years of being in this particular body and keeping thinking the same things over and over again, that whole world crashes back. So when Buddha says, with our thoughts we make the world, it is the I, the state of that I, whether that I is a simple identification with a separate functional body-mind. We need a name in order to be able to interact with the world. A simple identification is not a problem. The problem comes when that identification is added to by the sense of individual personal doership. The I that has a simple identification will see the world in a completely different way, in the way that the Buddhas describe how the world is. This very body, the Buddha, this very place, the lotus paradise. That's how Buddha sees the world. It's the freedom of that particular simple identification with a separate body-mind that allows that world to be in place for Buddha. And if that identification is still clouded with the ideas of separation and doership, then of course the world appears in a very, very different light, full of fear, full of danger, full of not belonging, full of separation, and then all of the pain and the suffering that this narrative of separation creates crashes back into being. That's, I think, what Buddha meant by that.
I've always wondered if, because so many times, like Aaron and I will have the same thought at the same time, and then one of us will verbalize it, but the second after the other person's had the thought, you have that moment of like, what? And it happens so frequently between us, the longer we've been together. It's always made me question if thoughts are just like a layer of the overarching stratum of consciousness. And like you said, like we're like a little radar that pick up on it, as opposed to my thoughts, my individuality. They can't be, can they? Our individuality, if they're part of consciousness.
I think, again, when you take possession of thoughts, who's taking possession? It's the separation, isn't it? The experience of thoughts in a body-mind that no longer sees itself as separate or sees itself as a separate doer is simply thoughts. They're not my thoughts. There isn't this sense of ownership about them. You simply observe them landing and passing through. And it still may be that you act on them, but you'll act in a way that's much more efficient and much more intelligent than you did when you were fighting them, when they were stimulating past experience inside of you that you haven't yet understood. And as far as being in a relationship with someone and how that happens, this common experience that anyone involved with a partner has of thinking the same things at the same moment, it's because the egoic separation between you has become less and less, apart from when you fight. Then it comes back. But basically what's happening in a loving partnership is that those boundaries of separation are dissolving. And what's being left? The one thing that is here, common to all of us, consciousness.
Have I got time? I think I've got time for one more. I'm going to struggle to put words to this, but you know how visual I am. So if we imagine on a visual picture, consciousness animating, moving through everything, thoughts being a part of that, like a layer or a stratum in that, would ego structure then be the same that we then pull down on in our individuality, in inverted commas? So thoughts are floating around, moving around. I don't know how to put words to this. It's going to be very clumsy. So thoughts are present. We, in our mind-body receiver, receive those thoughts, sometimes overly identify with them as our thoughts, or are able to just witness and see them for what they are. Would ego structure then fall into something similar, in that it's not my individual ego, it's ego as an energy that then forms a structure in the mind-body?
Ego is just a belief. It's just an idea. It's just a concept. So, yeah, of course, you feel it as yours, but it has no substance. It has no real basis. It's terribly difficult to understand that when you're in the grip of an egoic reaction. And the ego will fight against it. What do you mean I don't exist? I'll show you that I exist. You see how you suffer? That's me existing. And of course those games will go on through the superego and all of the aspects of the ego. But fundamentally the ego is simply an idea that comes and goes completely every 24 hours. In deep sleep, there is no trace of an ego whatsoever. Now, reality is that which doesn't change. Reality is that which is always present. The ego does not qualify. By your own experience, you know that thankfully and beautifully in those incredibly restful and restorative periods of, say, 2 hours of deep sleep that we're all hopefully lucky enough to have in our lives, the ego is gone completely. And without it, you'd be a blathering wreck. Without it, it's one of the ways that people use when they try and extract information from people unwillingly, because they deprive them of sleep. So if you see that this idea that you have disappears regularly, daily, every single 24 hours, you are not that you are not a little bit, you are gone, gate, finished. You are completely disappeared. That cannot be something that we could call real. So it is simply a belief, no matter how strong and the grip of its tentacles are in our lives. That is as it has to be also. But there are a few individuals with particular destinies who become interested in inquiring behind this grip of the ego, behind this idea of separation. And that inquiry is simply the direct route to freedom. That inquiry is the way you can see the falsity of it and let it go. And then in that absence of that belief, everything simply just takes place. They're no longer your thoughts, they're thoughts. They're no longer your happiness, it's happiness. Now, the miracle of that is you no longer may describe happiness as you experience it as your happiness, but the feeling of that happiness will be stronger than it ever was when you used to describe it as your happiness. Why? Because there is no separation getting in the way between you and that pure experience now. That's why feeling increases with understanding. It's the absence of the restriction of a personal viewpoint, of a personal perspective. It's the absence of that that allows you the full immersion and beauty into the purity of whatever the experience is. And that is the highest possible way to be alive in a human body. And that's why it's worth it.
I feel like that was powerful. Maybe we should meditate on that.
Great, Jack, and thank you so much. It was a lovely meeting this morning, and I thank you and all of your students and friends who helped give information to the questions that you asked. And we'll end, as we always do, back in our originality, back to the very substance of where we came from, the silence that we emerge from, and just be there with whatever is.